We're good to go. All right. So as I was starting to say, I want to shift back to domestic issues this week and to more kind of nuts and bolts day-to-day focus on American politics. It's actually been quite a while since we've done this. And the reason I want to do this is twofold. On the one hand, as the title says, I think we're in a make or break month for Joe Biden's domestic agenda. And I'll get into this more. I think we have to be careful to think what's happening this month is always the most important thing in the world. But at least in light of the redistricting that's about to occur, in light of the typical trends in American politics about the party in power, the party that controls the presidency being punished in the off-term election, the fact that Joe Biden's approval rating is slipping, and the razor-thin margin that the Democrats have in both houses of Congress, I think it's extremely likely that Joe Biden and the Democrats will lose one or both chambers of Congress in the 2022 midterm elections. Now, I will add immediately one of the big developments of the week, of course, was that the Texas anti-abortion statute went into effect and the Supreme Court let it stand. And I'm not sure, but this is a territory where it's, I think, foolish to predict. But I think there's a scenario in which the Republicans may really have overplayed their hand in Texas. They may be the proverbial dog that caught the car. Not that this is anything to be made light of, right? Millions of women are losing a right they had taken for granted for 40, 50 years in Texas this week, this month. But in terms of domestic politics, whether that results in further erosion of Republican support on the part of suburban women, for instance, a key demographic group that they've been losing fairly consistently for quite a long time, and that there's been an accelerating loss of support from in the Trump eras, it's entirely possible that maybe things are not quite as bad for the Democrats as they appear to be at this moment. But having said that, we have a lot on the legislative agenda for September of 2021. And I do think it's important to focus on it and to think for a little while about what the stakes are and how transformative this agenda could be, but how razor thin the path is for it actually advancing. And I am also going to start today a little bit of a thematic for our lectures for the month of September, which have to do with new scholarship on race and race in American politics. And obviously going back to the murder of George Floyd, the trial of Derek Chauvin, the Black Lives Matter movement, Biden's declaration that this was the crisis of racial justice, the moment of racial reckoning, was one of the justifying causes of his presidency. I think it's important to think about the racial politics of infrastructure as the big legislative push in September will be to get infrastructure legislation passed. And so that's what I'll talk with you about today. Let me start with an overview. And this is the politics of infrastructure primarily, but also the budget and the debt ceiling. And much of this will transpire this month. So to begin with, right, in July, with great fanfare, the Senate passed an infrastructure bill, and I'm calling it a $550 billion infrastructure bill. That is at least the new expenditure in the bill. There's other provisions and expenditures, but they involve reappropriating money that has already been allocated into this bill, so that the total worth of this bill approaches $1 trillion. And even if we just put it at the $550 billion level, a smile saying only 550 billion, this would still be the largest infrastructure investment in the United States since the interstate highway system. And having said that, let me now shift away from the Senate, where this legislation has passed, into the House of Representatives. And as you may be aware, there is a group of moderate Democrats in the House who have essentially demanded that the bipartisan infrastructure bill be considered on its own. And then there's the House leadership under Nancy Pelosi and a substantial, more progressive wing of the Democratic Party that has said it is unwilling to consider the pared down bipartisan infrastructure bill unless it is coupled with a larger bill that will be passed with exclusively Democratic support through the reconciliation process in the Senate in order to overcome the threat of filibuster. To be just cover the background here for a moment, generally speaking, legislation cannot pass the Senate without the support of 60 senators, because the filibuster has been has become a kind of go-to mechanism for obstructing or blocking legislation. It takes 60 votes to pass a closure motion, which is what's required to overcome a filibuster or the threat of a filibuster. And the Democrats are never going to get there, right? They've got 50 votes. It's a 50-50 tie, with Kamala Harris breaking that tie to give them a 51-50 majority on the larger budget effort, which includes much that was pared out of the infrastructure bill to gain bipartisan support. It's actually an interesting legislative maneuver, indicating what can be done through bipartisan means and what has to be done on a purely partisan basis by separating them out into two distinct bills and using two distinct legislative processes to pass them. Back to the progressives in the House, right? They're saying, we don't want to vote on the infrastructure deal from the Senate without also voting on a much larger budget bill that contains many of the priorities that were shorn from the original Biden infrastructure proposal. And the moderates are saying, no, we want to vote on the bipartisan bill by itself. It's too important to hang up. And so the compromise they've reached is that the moderates have given the Congress until September 27th to hammer out the budget, or else they will demand that the infrastructure deal be voted on alone. And this means that the next 4 weeks are going to be a week of frantic politicking and legislating if the Democrats are going to get this done. I'll talk about the details of the two different bills in just a moment, but now I want to focus more on politics than policy. And so I'll just start by noting, in order for the Democrats to pass the budget using reconciliation in the Senate, they need every Democratic vote. Of course, that includes an independent or two as well, or else some Republicans to join them. It's, I think, inconceivable that Republicans will join them on this. So really, Kristen Sinema of Arizona, Joe Manchin of West Virginia are in the driver's seat, right? The most moderate or most conservative of the Democrats. Kristen Sinema has already said that the price tag is too high, that she will not vote for $3.5 trillion. We will have to see how the politicking proceeds. But I do think it's worthwhile noting in this context that Biden, who has proposed all of this, who is trying to shepherd all of this through Congress, who in a sense has staked his presidency on these measures that would be dramatically transformative of federal priorities of government and of the US economy as a whole, has not had a good month. And so I'll show you very quickly. This is Biden's approval rating, right? And this is the 538 average of polls. And as you can see, Biden enjoyed positive approval rating through basically the end of July. And, this is much better than Donald Trump, who really never got much out of the 40s in terms of his approval rating. And though Biden's approval rating has sunk over the last couple of weeks, driven, it's hard to say for sure, but certainly in part by the chaos that surrounded the withdrawal of American troops from Afghanistan, by the loss of Afghanistan to the Taliban, but also by the resurgence of the coronavirus after Biden had essentially declared victory over the coronavirus in July. That the economic consequences of the resurgence of the Delta variant of the coronavirus, all of that is dragging him down. And so at this point, his approval is a net negative. More people disapprove than approve of him. I don't know how soft or hard this is. These things do fluctuate, but certainly Biden has perhaps less political capital entering this critical phase of his presidency, this critical month. And this is then going to further complicate things for the Democrats. I will also note, right, that there's another major legislative issue working in the background right now, but it's going to come to the foreground very quickly, and that's the debt ceiling issue. So back in July of 2019, Congress passed legislation basically allowing for an extension of the debt ceiling through July of 2021. Guess what? We're now in September, right? And so the Treasury has been using its emergency powers to pay the debts and obligations of the United States, but we will very quickly hit up against the debt ceiling. I don't know if it'll happen this month or next month, but this will become a focal point for the Congress if a raising of the debt ceiling does not pass. This means that the US will not be able to pay its debts. Those debts take the form of treasury bonds. Those treasury bonds are held by sovereign wealth funds the world over. That means that the governments of China and Saudi Arabia and Japan are relying on the US paying its dividends on its treasury bonds. If we stop doing that, it doesn't just damage the good faith and credit of the United States, it damages the world economy. And so this will become an emergency as we approach the debt ceiling, and this will be another issue on which a lot of domestic attention will be focused. There's a history here of the Republican Party holding the debt ceiling hostage in order to accomplish its other domestic agendas. We will have to see whether the fact that Biden seems to be diminished, that there's a good prospect for the Republicans regaining Congress, emboldens them to pursue more brinkmanship with the debt ceiling in the coming months. Finally, not quite finally, but in terms of the background to all this, I think we've got to look at the economics as well. And part of the justification for these really very large commitments of federal resources is to repair the damage that the coronavirus caused recession has done to the American economy, but also in an effort to restore some greater equity, some greater security, some greater mobility to the working and middle class of the United States. And so the pace of the recovery has a lot to do with this. There's an economic background to all of this. And when we look at the economic data, as you are well aware, last month's jobs data came in yesterday. It was not as strong as most economists hoped it would be. If you look at this, this is kind of a step function, right? And we really fell off a cliff back in March of 2020, and we have been slowly digging our way out of the hole that the steepest recession since the Great Depression put us in. And when I say slowly, actually, right, there have been some months in which we've made really quite remarkable gains. And two of those months occurred this summer in June and July, where we averaged adding almost 1 million jobs a month. So in that context, adding only 225,000 jobs in August is very disappointing news. And the result is that unemployment is still quite high. Labor force participation is still diminished in a way that suggests that the unemployment numbers or the jobs growth numbers are not really capturing the full impact of what the coronavirus has done to the labor market. There are just a lot of people who would be in the labor market who are not in the labor market right now. There are racially specific dimensions to this. White people are being hit least hard. It depends on what period we're in, but Hispanics and African Americans have been hit harder, right? And so that there are significant gaps in the unemployment rate between whites, Blacks, and Latinos. And so there's a further issue of equity there. The people who can least afford to bear the brunt of the economic hardship the recession is causing are those who are in fact forced to bear it. And then finally, there is, I think, some more bad news with regards to the economy, and that has to do with consumer confidence. And of course, lurking in the background of all of this is the fact that there are now 100,000 Americans hospitalized with COVID-19. Right? And that's just a grim figure. We are approaching some of the highest rates of hospitalization. The Delta variant is more contagious. It's also more virulent. It's better at defeating the immune system. It makes those who catch it sicker. It's attacking younger people or causing them more serious health problems. It is breaking through the vaccines. It's not creating serious or grave illness in the vast majority of people who are vaccinated, but it appears able to penetrate the shield the vaccine gives us. And that's a problem, especially for the transmission of the Delta variant, because people who think they are protected, in fact, end up infected and then end up transmitting it unknowingly. So all of that is making consumers worry, right? Are we headed back to mandatory closures of schools and businesses? Are we perhaps going back, as opposed to out of the recession into the recession? Maybe we'd better be very careful with our money. And when consumer confidence goes down, that creates a major drag on the economy. It can be a self-reinforcing cycle. And as you can see, right, consumer confidence using various measures has gone down quite substantially between July and August of this year. The final thing to note is that there does seem to be some genuine signs that inflation is an issue for our economy. And I just want to say this because I know many of us remember the inflation of the 1970s. that it's worthwhile noting the kind of inflation we seem to be experiencing in 2021 is different from the kind of inflation we experienced in the 1970s. The phrase that's sometimes used for the 1970s inflation is there was too much money chasing too few goods. That is to say, it's a global macroeconomic problem. And in order to combat it, you have to contract the money supply, which means raising interest, which tends to generate a recession and unemployment. Obviously, that would not be good to have to do that, given all the other problems our economy is experiencing due to the coronavirus. But I don't believe that's the kind of inflation we're experiencing in 2021. I think the kind of inflation we're experiencing is much more sector specific. So, to take an example, car prices, especially used car prices, but also new car prices, due to some peculiarities of the global supply chain to do with semiconductors and chips, also due to some odd stuff that the rental car industry did in the middle of the pandemic. There's no doubt car prices have increased dramatically, as has energy prices or housing prices. And these are major contributors then to the overall rate of inflation, to average prices going up. But average prices are not going up across the board, right? As opposed to that, they're going up in targeted areas in the economy, energy prices as well, that where we have bottlenecks, where we have shortages or an excess of demand relative to supply. That is a very different scenario, right? And to be clear, it's one that doesn't seem to demand the kind of cross the board macroeconomic policy measures that we saw in the 1970s. And Jerome Powell, Jay Powell at the Federal Reserve seems to be very clear about that. So the economic news, to go back now to the overall overview of the politics of September 2021, this may also create a drag for Joe Biden, a dent in his popularity, concerns about his leadership, and that may diminish his capacity to get this legislation passed. But please note the flip side of this. It may also increase the felt urgency to stimulate the economy if the economy is starting to sputter, as opposed to continuing a fairly robust recovery. That may give Biden another tool with which to make the case. So now let me start to pivot to the policy dimensions. And I want to give you some information about what all is included in this legislation. Before I do that, I just want to point out that in a sense, this initiative, right, the initiative that Biden has put together in a package of legislation. And let's note that this starts with a $1.9 trillion stimulus bill passed in the first month of his presidency, and then includes the bipartisan infrastructure deal, and then a whole bunch of other legislation that is being passed in the budget through the reconciliation process that was originally proposed as independent legislation. The combined effect of those three measures would be to counteract a half a century of what's sometimes called, rather euphemistically, strategic disinvestment. And to be clear, for roughly half a century, beginning in the 1970s and then really taking hold in the 1980s, we have been cutting taxes and cutting the provision of government services. The big legislative efforts to use the government to promote economic growth or to change the nature of the economy, to reduce poverty or inequality, or to promote technological resources, research, I should say, or housing, or other aspects of infrastructure, essentially we have neglected for around 50 years. And the result of this is that the American College of Engineers gives our infrastructure a failing grade. Our sewage and waste processing facilities a D plus, our water supply a D minus, right? That there are core aspects of our provision of public goods that are dangerously degraded as a result of neglect. And then there is the rise in inequality and the populist backlash against government that it's driving. And the, I think, underlying vision behind this legislation is to say government must do more. It must do more to protect our physical human infrastructure, but also, our physical infrastructure, but also our human infrastructure. Let me stop for just a second because I'm about to jump into the details of this legislation. Before I do that, I just want to ask, are there questions or thoughts about what I've said so far about the politics emerging this month around these critical bills? All right, then I'm going to push on. As always, just feel free whenever you have a question, a comment, to throw it in, right? Unmute yourself and speak, or put it in the chat bar, whatever is easiest for you. Please don't hesitate. As you know, I like being in dialogue with you guys. Let me now get into Biden's original proposal. And you know, I'm not going to break this all down for you, but I'm going to point out to you that he, in a sense, split his original plan in two. This is sometimes referred to as human versus physical infrastructure, though the divide is not quite as neat and clean as that. The roughly $2 trillion in proposals that are shaded teal, that was the family's plan. The more than $2 trillion that are shaded salmon, this is more the infrastructure and especially the physical infrastructure plan. And I just want to highlight certain measures, right? So to begin with, right, $600 billion to expand the child earned income and child independent tax credits. And I want to be clear, right? This was done for this year already by the stimulus plan that passed in the first month of Biden's presidency. Those checks have actually gone out already. Depending on the age of the child, the family receives $200 or $300 per month. This is a radical experiment in something like basic income so that families that are poor do not raise children in poverty and economic insecurity, right? And the literature on what poverty and insecurity do to parents and children, the way in which it distracts parents with stress, it diminishes their patience. The experience of childhood food insecurity has lifelong impacts on learning and on psychological well-being. The case for this, I think, is very strong. And please note that between this program starting a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, and the supplemental unemployment insurance that was part of the Trump stimulus package and then extended by the Biden stimulus package, has pushed poverty down by more than 50% in the United States today. I think it's just worth noting what a remarkable achievement that is in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of a recession, that this is something that I think we should be noticing and proud of having done as a society. And I just want to pause for a moment and say, there's an idea in policy circles, the so-called policy feedback loop. You take Social Security, right? It was controversial when it was passed, but then people started getting the Social Security benefits, right? People started having much greater security in their retirement if they were disabled, et cetera. And the fact that they liked the benefit led them to support the policy and the politicians who supported the policy, right? And so this resulted in Franklin Delano Roosevelt winning multiple elections, the Democrats winning multiple elections, and the program becoming the so-called third rail of American politics, right? You don't touch it unless you want to die. Don't try to mess with our Social Security. And um, it's, I think, a little early to tell. The hope, the aspiration is that if we do this, and so the $600 billion here is to extend this for 5 years, right? And so right now it's in place for 1 year. Can we put it in place for 4 more years? If so, would that generate that kind of feedback loop in which it would become so popular that it would be very difficult to eliminate? And please note that in a sense, so far, we're not seeing that kind of feedback loop. Like I say, it's very early, but the fact that Biden's popularity is going down, and more or less exactly at the same time that the first of these checks are going out. And if you look at social media, there are lots of people celebrating the fact that they are receiving these checks. And note that they're going to all families with children, even though obviously not everybody has equal need. But that fact that it's being celebrated does not seem to have produced any immediate political dividend for Joe Biden. Also, in this portion of the pie, the ACA premium tax credit expansion. Again, some of this has already been done in the stimulus package. This would be to extend it to make the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, more affordable for more Americans. And please note, Medicaid expansion is part of this, paid family and medical leave. Here's one of the, I think, the really big issues: childcare, along with care for people with disabilities and older adults, and free universal preschool, right? And so the label that's sometimes used for this is more care, less carbon for the overall proposal. And as I've just pointed out, basically nearly $1 trillion of the nearly $4 trillion, nearly a quarter of the overall cost of this legislation goes for things related to care. Universal pre-K, which has been tried in various cities in the United States and has, I think, combined with childcare, a real urgency in the context of the pandemic, in which women's labor force participation has gone down substantially as schools have closed and women have taken up much of the slack of childcare. And so there's a particular perhaps opportunity to do this in this moment, but this is stuff that's done in most of the rest of the developed world, right? Care for the elderly, for people with disabilities, for young children is considered a social responsibility and is therefore subsidized. In the United States, we have not done this in an adequate way up until now. The proposals, one of the really big ticket items in the proposal would be to try to repair that. Lots of money for education from pre-K through colleges and universities, including stuff for historically Black colleges and universities, fair bit of money for jobs and innovation, lots for transportation. And when we start talking about the less carbon stuff, the idea behind the jobs, innovation, transportation, buildings and utilities is to decarbonize the economy, or at least critical sectors of it, to recognize, as we see what Hurricane Ida did first to Louisiana and then did to the Northeast, the likelihood of extreme weather doing more and more damage. And of course, I don't need to talk with you about what's happening in the Lake Tahoe area, the terrible fires ravaging the West again this year, as they have for several years in the past, the droughts, the flooding, the hurricanes. We need to modernize our transportation infrastructure, our buildings and utilities in order to protect against climate change, but we also need to revamp our economy, our transportation infrastructure, our buildings, our jobs, in order to not contribute so much carbon and other greenhouse gases to the environment. And so the bill contains a lot on that front. For instance, electric vehicle incentives. It also has a substantial portion of money for affordable housing. Again, I just think it's worthwhile noting, right? The eviction moratorium has just expired or been held to be unconstitutional in terms of the capacity of the administration to extend it. And so hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Americans will be facing evictions and foreclosures this fall and winter. And that calls to attention that we have a major affordable housing crisis in the United States. We need more dense housing built in the areas where the jobs are in the most expensive cities in the United States. And again, there's a lot of money in this bill targeted for that. So that gives you a sense. This is what Joe Biden proposed in May of this year. And I now want to transition into what the Senate did and didn't do. And so this is a slightly different version of that diagram. And it shows you on the one hand what Biden proposed. This is because this is now June and July, slightly different version of it, and what the Senate actually did in order to secure bipartisan support for the legislation. As you can see, research and development and manufacturing went from $566 billion to $0. Housing, schools, and buildings went from almost $400 billion to $0. Home and community-based care went from $400 billion to $0. Clean energy tax credits went from $363 billion to $0. And then what remained, everything in the bill was shrunk and shrunk considerably, right? That's why you've got these little colored areas that are contractions of what was in the original bill. That's how you get from 2.6 trillion to 500 billion, right? And so this is why then the Democrats want to pass a separate package of legislation through the reconciliation process that includes a fair bit, most of what was in the original Biden plan, not as a bipartisan infrastructure bill, but as a partisan budget bill. And I just want to point out briefly to you, again, some of what now looks like it will be in that new bill. And in light of the time, I think I won't emphasize most of this, but affordable housing, high-speed broadband. Let me spend just a moment on this. And as you can see, $200+ billion for affordable housing, 100 billion for high-speed broadband. And this is primarily for rural areas in America. The analogy that is being used is the electrification of rural America during the New Deal, during the 1930s. And the idea is that as important as electricity was for rural America in the early 20th century, high-speed broadband is for the 21st century. That this is the information highway on which modern communication, modern industry, modern economics relies, and the fact that it is unevenly available, and in particular that the parts of the country that have seen the least economic growth over the last 50 years also have the least high-speed broadband infrastructure. They most need this investment. Similarly, there's another 100 billion for electrical grid and clean energy investments. And obviously, with the down power wires causing fires in California, we understand that the grid needs maintenance. Even more importantly, as solar and wind have become more affordable, we need to transition to a decarbonized energy infrastructure. It's not cheap to do so, but in the long term, it's not only much more cost effective, but it's the only environmentally sound thing to do. Money here for public schools, for water systems. And let me just say a little bit about this. As I think I mentioned, right, the American College of Engineers gives the United States a D+ for its waste treatment and a D- for its drinking water infrastructure. And I live in Westchester County in New York, right outside of New York City. The town immediately neighboring where I teach, Mount Vernon, has a waste system, a sewage system that's over 100 years old. It uses ceramic pipes. They frequently break whenever we have a big storm. I haven't heard the reports on what happened with Ida. I dread to think, but whenever we have a typical big storm, an inch or two of rain, not the 8 inches we got last week, sewage backs up into the houses and apartments of the residents of Mount Vernon, New York. Now, who are the residents of Mount Vernon, New York? It is a dominantly African American and Latino community. These are the people who have been priced out of northern Manhattan and Brooklyn as those communities have gentrified. It's a 80% plus people of color community. Does this happen in the neighboring town of Bronxville, right, directly bordering it, or Scarsdale, or the affluent communities proximate to it in Westchester County? Absolutely not. And this is a very good example of, I think, strategic disinvestment. It's not uniform disinvestment. It's disinvestment from the poorer urban and rural communities of the United States, communities that are frankly discriminated against because they are primarily Black and brown, that have lacked political power, that have lacked economic power. And so when we talk about putting $66 billion into water systems, we're not just maintaining the nation's infrastructure, which is essential. We are also remedying historical injustice. Transportation, very quickly, electric vehicle incentives, roads and bridges, public transport. Some of this has to do with the greening of the economy. Many of the elements of this bill were part of the so-called Green New Deal. It hasn't been marketed in that way, but elements of it are still there. But some of this is just basic infrastructure management. And we are suffering a slow burning crisis in transportation in this country. And we have to do something about it, or it will continue to get worse. We lose billions of dollars a year in automobile maintenance due to the degraded quality of our roads. Jobs and innovation, smaller ticket items, relatively speaking, but putting stuff into research, into supply chain, into the semiconductor industry, in a sense, trying to create a little bit more self-reliance in some of these industries and the National Science Foundation trying to spur domestic research and technology growth in the United States. All right, so that gives you a little bit more of a sense of what's in these bills and what, in a sense, the Democrats will have to figure out if they can get progress on. And the time frame is tight, highly compressed. The margin for error nearly non-existent. Kristen Sinema, as I say, has already said she will not go along with a $3.5 trillion package. So the House moderates have basically said, and I think in a sense this is the right approach, that they are not going to try to hammer out the bill for the budget in the House, that they want the Senate to do this. So the ball is in the Senate's court. And that means that Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema have to be persuaded, or to put it differently, they have almost a veto over important elements of this, and how much Biden and their colleagues will be able to push them along, how risky it will be for the Democrats to lose progressives in the House if Sinema and Manchin and others pare back the overall budget. I think it's going to be hard politics for the month of September. The final thing I wanted to talk with you about today is thinking now about race and justice and what we know about social policy and infrastructure expenditures in the 20th century, and how that can illuminate what needs to be done in the 21st century. And so I'll start with the basic idea that in the last 90 years, African Americans have in fact improved their situation in this country relative to where they were, right? And so their income, their jobs, their wealth have increased, as have their rights. Obviously, the whole system of Jim Crow segregation and disenfranchisement has been dismantled. Voting rights are much better protected. And there is a developed African American middle class, although quite fragile, and an African American elite, things that there really weren't in the 1930s in America. But having said all of that, we also have to recognize that relative to white Americans, African Americans are actually worse off in 2020 than they were relative to white Americans in 1930, right? And this is not because African Americans have not gotten better off, it's because white Americans got much better off over this same period. And this is true whether we speak of wealth, income, health, education, basically all major metrics of social well-being, as well as their degree of social isolation, right? Which is to say that African Americans are more segregated in America today than they were in the 1930s, 1940s, 1950s. That is to say, during the Jim Crow period, right? And the well-being of whites has increased more rapidly because of law and policy. And a substantial portion of that has to do with housing policy, with the availability through the GI Bill of mortgage support, with federal regulation of the banking industry to make mortgages more readily available. The federal provision of mortgage insurance took house ownership from being essentially an elite privilege to being a middle class expectation for white America. But as I've spoken with you about before, whether we're talking about the important work by Richard Rothstein on The Color of Law, or the very important work of Ira Katz Nelson on When Affirmative Action Was White, those policies were racially administered. They were administered, that race was not in the actual statutes themselves, but the statutes were administered in the states in a racist way. And I want to be clear here, right? The federal government actually did have racist laws in the first half of the 20th century that, for instance, required municipalities to put racial covenants in the deeds to homes in order to secure federal housing development funds, right? So we've got redlining, we've got block busting by the real estate industry, we've got the federal government itself creating segregated housing. This is all part of the story of 20th century infrastructure. And I want to be as clear as possible. The black-white wealth gap in the United States is large and it is stubborn. The most recent figures suggest it's about 14-1. Even the poorest white family has 14 times more wealth than a poor black family. And this goes across the board, right? And this was not simply a product of racism in the market. It was engineered through public policy, and a lot of that policy is infrastructure policy. I focused in the first instance on housing, but we need to focus on other issues as well. Where highways were placed, right? They were put through poor, largely black neighborhoods. They were often deliberately used to create an artificial border between a more affluent white community and a poorer black or brown community. It also includes where public transport was created, who it serves, whether the trains are above ground or underground, what it does to the quality of life in a neighborhood to have trains go above ground, and the noise pollution that it generates. And then there is the use of so-called racially targeted sacrifice zones. And this means, I think Richmond, California is a really good illustration. If we have to have major refinery complex in the San Francisco Bay Area, where should we put it? Let's put it in the poorest ghetto community in the area. And then, by the way, let's construct public housing for African Americans, right? Segregated by design, by policy, by law, by the federal government as World War II and then the post-war period was unfolding. Let's surround the refineries with black areas. This is a sacrifice zone. If you look at where the waste processing facilities, where the garbage dumps are, where the toxic waste sites are, where the big factories are in the United States, you can see again and again and again a pattern of putting the most toxic, most dangerous, the infrastructure most likely to depress housing values in areas where white people don't live. And of course, and I'm reading right now Heather McGhee's The Sum of Us. One of the things she points out, the title of the chapter is The Same Sky. Air does not stay in one neighborhood. It ends up affecting all of us. And many societies that don't have the racial divide that America has have not created sacrifice zones. As opposed to that, they've managed their toxic waste disposal, their refineries, their garbage processing in a way that creates fewer hazards for everyone, right? We did not do that as we built our modern infrastructure in the 20th century. The result is, again, both disparities in health, well-being, wealth, and income. Whether we're talking about the placement of hospitals, the placement of fire departments, the resources donated to schools, dedicated to schools, right? The pattern of strategic disinvestment has not been uniform across the board. We have spent much more on mainly white suburbs and mainly white communities than we have on areas populated by Black and brown people. And all of this is clearly unjust. Much of it is in fact unconstitutional. Much of it was secreted in under the radar of public consciousness. Black Lives Matter and the kind of scholarship I was just citing to is calling it to our attention, but there's still far too little public awareness of it. And I say all of this because it seems to me, right, that the vast majority of white Americans have until quite recently been absolutely ignorant and indifferent, apathetic with regards to all of this. And as we consider a major, right, a once in a generation, a once maybe in a century reinvestment in infrastructure, we have to bear in mind how unfair, unjust, and racist past infrastructure policy has been, so as to hold Congress to account and to hold the state and local officials who will implement and administer much of this program so that this kind of inequity is not repeated in the 21st century. All right, I will stop there. And of course, I want to hear your questions, your thoughts, what you think of the prospects of all of this. Who wants to start us out? Flossie, unmute yourself. You got it? I'm still not hearing you. You got to hold that space bar down. There you go.
Yeah.
Yep. Oh no, Flossie, I'm sorry, you're still muted.
Figure that out.
Flossie, maybe you can hit the little microphone icon if it's got a red line through it to get rid of that red line. I'm unable to hear you.
No.
Yes, you got it. Good.
I want a shout out to the people of MSNBC and the moving picture industry. I think they're trying as hard as they can to make it clear that Black lives matter to them. So we have a great many more Black commentators than I've ever seen before. And Netflix and Amazon, I think they produce one picture a week, and there's always something for the Black community. They're doing their bit, but they're not taking care of the cancer that lies below. So they're taking care of, they're acting. They are making us aware that Black lives matter, but the real work now begins.
Yeah, it's funny. I
just wanted to give them some credit.
The year in which The Wire was produced, I remember hearing the producer of The Wire interviewed and him saying that African Americans had come up to him and said, you know, there are 160 channels of white TV, and then there's your show, right?
Yes.
The Wire was produced, originally aired in 2002. So 20 years does make a difference, right? Yeah. Please note that this is driven in part by market forces as well, right? Which is to say that our public is becoming more diverse. And in particular, the people who have consumer spending, discretionary income, the people who buy Hulu and Netflix and HBO Prime, et cetera. HBO, I think I made that up, but whatever the HBO subscription services, Amazon Prime, they tend to be people who live in diverse areas, right? And I do think, you know, speaking now in quite general terms, that if you live in a diverse area, you often get accustomed to, you have contact with, you begin to actually see the advantages and value of diversity, right? And by the way, I spoke to Richmond and what happened in Richmond with where the refineries were located, and the data on how damaging that has been to the lungs of the residents of Richmond is truly awful. I think I have mentioned to you before, I went to high school in Richmond. I still have family in the area. I still follow Richmond politics. That there was actually a very successful coalition in Richmond that included Asian Americans, African Americans, people from various Latino derivations, and white Americans that finally stood up to Chevron and did not grant them their permit to modernize their refinery without significant safety precautions and investments in the community. And so one of the things, again, I'm reading Heather McGee. I'll talk with you about her work later this month. One of the things to note is that when we maybe see on Netflix images of broad and diverse coalitions working together, we begin to think of that as possible. We begin to imagine a world in which we might be able to come together. It is happening in certain places in the United States right now, and we are improved by it. But I think we have to be very careful if this infrastructure bill or bills do progress to really keep a spotlight on not what's on Netflix, but what's in this legislation. Please note that part of what's happened with strategic disinvestment is we pay our government employees much less than we did in adjusted dollars 50, 60, 70 years ago. And so the legislative staff in Congress is not as capable as it was 50, 60, 70 years ago. They are both dependent on and often outgunned by lobbyists, right? And so we have to be very, I think, alert, very vigilant in thinking about the racial justice component to this. At the same time that we've got to, if you support this legislation, absolutely pull for Congress getting it done. And it's a very, very narrow path and tight time frame to success.
I have to call out, David, that there is some hope. And Richmond, California is now a rather nice place to visit.
Yeah.
Very much integrated.
And I enjoy my time there. And you know, I'm not exactly sure which aspect of it you're talking about, but there's a vigorous arts community.
There is a big hospital. There's a big Kaiser hospital,
Yes.
and it began after World War II with just a series of little bungalows.
Yes. Yeah.
So, not that I'm not desperately unhappy these days, but I'm looking for something to hold on to.
Good. Good. Thank you, Flossie. Anybody else with a thought or a question?
I'm fine. Thank you.
Anything on the details of the infrastructure bill or the other proposals the Democrats are putting forward or its legislative prospects? All right. Well, then I guess that's a wrap. And it was fun as always spending the Saturday morning with you guys. And take care of yourselves. As I said, right, there are 100,000 Americans hospitalized right now. The coronavirus is particularly dangerous at the moment. Please be careful. Take care.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, David.
Bye.
Thank you.